Good morning and welcome. My name is Craig Clay. I'm Executive Vice President at R.R. Donnelley. As a founding member of the Data Transparency Coalition, Donnelley is honored to kick off today's keynote speech. Donnelley has an unwavering dedication to innovation and service quality. We are proud to serve 60,000 customers across 4 continents and in 37 countries. As the only XBRL provider in production with major government regulators in America, Europe, and in Asia, R.R. Donnelley understands the forthcoming challenge in fulfilling the new requirements of the U.S. Data Act. And to all of you in the audience who face the daunting task of embarking on the Data Act pilot programs, there are benefits. The Data Act implementation doesn't require changing agencies' existing systems. It's a simple exercise in mapping existing data to new standards. Based on our experience, transparency drives benefits to the reporting entity as well as to the consumers of the data. Donnelley helped the FDIC and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Reserve Bank expedite their reporting process while positively impacting data accuracy. Prior to implementation, it took the FDIC 60 days to vet and publish data. After deploying the Donnelley solution with built-in validation to flag errors, banks are now prompted to correct erroneous reports before submitting them, and it's reduced the reporting cycle from 60 days to 2. This 58-day improvement sits as an efficiency within the FDIC, and it makes it easier for them to do the work that they do. While I'm extremely excited to collaborate on the transformation of federal spending, I'm equally as excited to welcome our keynote speaker, Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice and the Chair of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. As Inspector General, Mr. Horowitz oversees a nationwide workforce of more than 400 special agents, auditors, inspectors, attorneys, and support staff whose mission it is to detect and deter waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct in the Department of Justice programs and personnel, and to promote an economy of efficiency and department operations. Please join me in welcoming Inspector Horowitz.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be here today. Thank you for having me be one of your keynote speakers. The topics and issues, having looked at the agenda and listened to the last panel that you're going to be addressing today, are really of vital importance to us in the Inspector General community. Having accessible and reliable data helps us in the Inspector General community as well as the public, hold accountable federal government programs and helps to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. And ultimately, we're talking about taxpayer dollars here and making the government more effective and efficient. We know in the Inspector General community that the best way to improve government programs is to obtain, and use reliable data so that we can assess how effective government programs are. We stand for transparency. That's one of the core principles for us in the Inspector General community. And that's what the Data Act is all about: transparency in spending, transparency in government programs. And that's why this act and the data it will put forward is so important to us. Without having a baseline understanding of how a program is spending its money, how that money is being put to use, and without being able to undertake a data-driven analysis, it's very difficult for us in the Inspector General community, it's very difficult for the public, to understand whether a program is working well and whether it can be made better. And so from our perspective in the IG community, we ask ourselves some basic questions every time we do a review. How is the program or the procedures or the policies, how are they working? Is the program fulfilling its stated goals? And can it be made to be more effective and more efficient? And without the data, that task becomes extremely difficult. And how, we ask ourselves, can an agency implement a program or a policy or procedures in its own programs and its own agency if it doesn't have that data, if it doesn't know that information. And we see all around us in government and outside government the effort to make data more transparent, as well as the ability to use that data through data analytics and other tools. I was a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Southern District of New York back in the 1990s, which encompasses Manhattan. And that was the time when, at that point, the first time he was commissioner, Bill Bratton, started what was called CompStat, which was policing based on data. Getting data, where were the crimes being committed? Where did there need to be increases in policing? How could they use the data about what was going on within each precinct to better police the city? And I actually was a public corruption prosecutor at the time in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And for those of you who may remember, or from New York, back in the late 1980s, 1990s, there was a serious issue with police corruption. Led to a commission being formed and looking at what were the causes and how extensive was police corruption in New York. And part of it was driven by what was going on with cocaine, with crack cocaine, and the issues that were associated with drug trafficking. And one of the things that found most interesting at the time was one of the ways the police department was using data, just to give you a sense of this, and now we're talking 20 plus years ago now, in thinking about the corruption problem, they were looking at where was the price of cocaine within New York City low, unusually low, in what precincts? And they used that data to consider whether that was an indication that they did not have effective policing going on in those precincts, and whether that meant perhaps the officers there was corruption and the drug dealers were operating more easily, and looking for wide variances among the data. And so just to give you a sense of how people who use information, if it's good information, in government can use and be creative with that information to solve and fight problems, I think is very important to consider. And I, as a baseball fan, like to think of the movie Moneyball. I don't know how many of you saw it or remember it, but of course it's about a executive who's sitting around, of course one of the scenes when you talk data analytics and you think about these issues, they're sitting around with some old line baseball scouts who talk about how you can't replace intuition, right? 20 years, I've been in the baseball 20 years, and I can just size up that kid on how they pitch or how they are. And of course you have the executives saying, it's all about the data. It's all about how many runs do we need to score? How often does this runner get on base? What are the metrics that we're really looking at? And that back and forth. That movie was based on a 2002 baseball season of the Oakland A's. They were forerunners at the time in this effort. I can tell you, in any sports area now, if you're not in the professional sports arena using data analytics and metrics and looking for data, you are falling way behind your competition. That's an indication of what the culture was, at least in the sports area in 2002, and where we are today, 13 years later, in the sports world, for example, and how far things have come. The same is true of policing. What I talked about in the early 1990s as being unique in New York, the CompStat model is what it was called, is now used across the board in large police departments, not only in New York, in the United States, but across the globe. And we're talking 20 years. That's a good thing. We've seen that evolution, but it also is an indication of sometimes how hard it is to move the debate and the discussion forward, and the pushback that you often get as you look for ways to gather data and use data differently than perhaps people have become used to. The subject of today's conference and summit, the Data Act, was designed to embrace these concepts and these principles that I just mentioned by establishing government-wide financial data standards and increasing the availability and accuracy and the usefulness of federal spending data. I'm one of the Inspector Generals who serves on the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board, which was created with the Recovery Act in 2009. And we put together and created recovery.gov, a website that gathered data about Recovery Act spending and made it public. And I think by all accounts, that was an extraordinarily successful effort at doing what we're talking about here today in the Data Act, although doing it at a much larger scale. And so I've seen firsthand how valuable and important and useful that kind of data can be when it's gathered and it is put together effectively and accurately on websites. And I think one of the concerns that we've seen in the Inspector General community, and I think it's been talked about, is usspending.gov, which has been online, but has frankly not been as complete or as accessible or in terms of the accuracy of data, as accurate as it could be. And hopefully, as we move forward with the Data Act, that will begin to change. And some of the principles that we've been able to accomplish and incorporated the Recovery Board as Inspectors General can be more broadly used within the federal government. I'm, as was mentioned, not only in the Inspector General at the Department of Justice, but I'm also the chair of something called the Councils of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. The acronym that people like to throw around, given this is Washington, is CIGIE, C-I-G-I-E. I like to call it the Council of IGs. What we do, we're the coordinating body for all 72 federal IGs. And if you're not familiar with the Inspector General community, there are 72 federal Inspectors General. There's one for every cabinet agency, and there are many, many others throughout the federal government for smaller and medium-sized non-cabinet level agencies as well. And our mission at the Council of Inspectors General is to help work with, among several missions, is to help work with those 72 Inspectors General in a way that helps them fulfill their mission and our mission jointly of making government programs more effective and efficient and deterring and detecting and preventing waste, fraud, and abuse. And so I have the two jobs, my day job at the Justice Department and chairing the Council of IGs, and from the perspective of the Council of IGs, I get to see what we are more broadly dealing with as a community on these issues, and in particular with regard to the Data Act. I also served, before becoming Inspector General in April 2012, in private law firm for 10 years. Among other things, I did work looking at internal investigations, regulatory compliance, worked with compliance and internal audit functions, and I saw there what was going on as well in the private sector and the transformation going on in the private sector over that 10-year period with regard to the use of big data, and data analytics. And I also served previously a term on the U.S. Sentencing Commission, which is 7 commissioners who put together the guidelines that judges use in evaluating and considering, federal judges use in considering what sentences to impose. And the Sentencing Commission collects data on every single sentencing, federal sentencing in the United States. That's 80,000 cases a year, compiles that data with our coders, codes it, uploads it. It's on the Commission's website. And as a commissioner, I can tell you I saw at that time, and this was about 10 years ago now, how critical that data was, and making sure and having accurate sentencing data was to the policy decisions we were making. These weren't financial decisions, obviously. These are sentencing decisions that we were evaluating and looking at. But the same holds true in that area as it does in the financial arena. Having reliable data, knowing what judges were sentencing people to, looking at what recidivism data looked like, and understanding that made for better public policy decisions by us. And it was clear to us what would happen if we didn't have that kind of data, what a challenge it would be for those of us in the public sector, and an area that is critical, obviously, sentencing issues, among the most serious issues we deal with in the government, deciding what someone should get sentenced to for committing a crime. Having that data was critical to our being able to make informed decisions as commissioners in writing those guidelines. With the data we currently have available to us as inspectors general, I just want to give you a sense of the kind of work we've done. I'll focus on fiscal year 2013. As I mentioned, there are 72 IGs. Those 72 IGs employ about 14,000 people in the federal government. So about 14,000 employees in the inspector general community. And of course, we conduct audits, inspections, reviews, investigations. We do a wide variety of work. We have a wide variety of functions. Those 14,000 employees and 72 inspectors general identified approximately $37 billion in potential cost savings in the federal government. And there was about $15 billion identified through investigative recoveries and receivables. In comparison, the budget for the 72 federal IGs during that fiscal year 2013 time period was $2.5 billion, which means there's about a $21 return on investment from the IG community for the work that we do. In the community, let me talk a little bit about what we're doing right now in response to the Data Act and trying to move forward and use what information we hope to get from the Data Act in a positive way. So we've undertaken efforts within the IG community. We've created within the Council of IGs, a working group that has already put together a consolidated library of open source software, algorithms, and data analytics tools as we as a community try and move forward in these areas. And that library is designed to provide a place for the IG community to collaborate and share best practices and the data analytics tools we are identifying and using. The working group is also utilizing the resources of OMB's website, max.gov, to develop an OIG-wide information sharing site to host that consolidated database of federal data sources. We're undertaking all of these efforts even before the Data Act and the triggers in the Data Act have been put in place. And I can speak from experience in the last 3 years at the Department of Justice about the challenges we've faced getting reliable data so that we can do our audit work. Having been a former federal prosecutor, worked with federal law enforcement, I know firsthand that what you often see in law enforcement is information touting how many indictments have we brought, how many individuals have been convicted, how many people have been arrested. And that was often the basis for the data, certainly at least within the Justice Department. And of course, that is a measure of performance, but it's not an outcome-based measure of performance. And I think that's one of the challenges for federal agencies, it certainly is for the Justice Department, is to get and collect useful data so that IGs, the public, you all can assess how the agencies are performing their work. We have done some reviews where we've identified issues with how the department was collecting data and whether it was collecting reliable data, which of course will go directly to the issues you're all going to be talking about today. It's fine to have data posted publicly, but that doesn't work if the data itself isn't reliable or the data being collected isn't reliable. We, in fact, as an inspectors general, we're required each year by statute to put out an annual top management challenges report to the department's leadership or for the department's leadership. This year we identified 7 challenges. One of them was, in fact, data-driven management and the collection of good data. That is one of the top challenges we see that I see as Inspector General at the Justice Department in terms of a top management challenge facing the department. And I know several of my colleagues across the IG community have similar views about the collection of data at their agencies. So, for example, we did a review a year and a half ago now about the department's performance and how it was pursuing mortgage fraud. Big question that had arisen was how was the department doing? It had gotten a fair amount of additional funds from Congress to pursue mortgage fraud, civilly and criminally, and how was the department doing? We did an audit to look at that issue, and what we found was we couldn't figure it out because the data wasn't there. In fact, what we did learn was when Attorney General Holder announced in 2012 the results of the mortgage fraud efforts in a one-year period in connection with a particular operation, it turned out that the information he had been given was off by, in some areas, 90%. And the Justice Department ultimately issued a press release reporting on its inaccurate earlier statistics. And that's one example that we've seen in the work we've done about some of the department components and their ability to have data. I'll give you another example. We've done a couple reports now on the department's use of drones, law enforcement's use of drones, but we also looked at grant-making agencies. The department has 3 grant-making agencies. We looked at their grants to local and state police departments and law enforcement at the state and local level, and we asked them, how much money have you given over this period of time to state and local law enforcement for grant-making purposes, for the purpose of purchasing drones? The answer was they didn't have the data. They couldn't find it readily. Ultimately, we did find it through our work and through some of the inquiries we made, but it was an example of how people weren't collecting the data they needed, and then as we went further, what we asked is, well, how was the performance measured of the grant? Money went out to the 2 agencies, there were 2 local law enforcement organizations, each got $75,000. It turned out that each had purchased a drone for the $75,000. And we asked, what was the outcome of that? What was the performance of that? Was it a valuable investment for the taxpayers, for the Justice Department? And the grant-making agency didn't know. And when we went to look, we discovered, in contacting the 2 entities, and this is all public, it's in our audit report, they actually hadn't used the drones. They bought the drones, but they'd never used them. They'd sat in the warehouse because they had issues with getting licenses and taking other steps. And so the department invested the money. From the department standpoint, it was spent as they had given out. No one had stolen it. No one had misused it. It went to purchase the drone, but no one was following up on it. And that's where the tools that we hope to be given as IGs through the Data Act, if implemented wisely, correctly, properly, will help us advance our work and make it easier for us to do the kinds of jobs we do day in, day out in the Inspector General community. And I can tell you, again, from my position as the chair of the Council of IGs, that that's my issues that I just identified aren't unique to the Justice Department. It's really a challenge across the federal government. And it's very important for us as a community, as an IG community, to work together to pool our knowledge, to pool our resources to understand how we best accomplish the goals that we are looking to accomplish through the implementation of the Data Act. So what have we done? We, in the Inspector General community, the Council of IGs created a working group earlier this year that has already begun meeting, and we've got 19 IGs currently involved in that working group. And one of the tasks for us, and one of the tasks for the working group, is to develop a common methodology for inspectors general to use and to audit the information that we are required to audit under the law, under the Data Act. So we're coordinating with federal agencies, with OMB, with Treasury, to understand how and if agencies have started their efforts to implement the data standards that have been issued by OMB at this point. We're being kept up to date by OMB and Treasury as they're making their progress in implementing the procedures and policies that they've put forward. And we also have access to, as IGs, and we utilize OMB's federal government-wide collaboration site to communicate with federal agencies and to monitor the progress of the data standards. The working group's also reached out and is coordinating closely with the Government Accountability Office. You'll hear from them shortly. We, as IGs, work very closely with the GAO across the board on issues. It's one of the things that we have done a fair amount of work in to make sure we're coordinated with each other, given our similar interests in terms of oversight. And the GAO, under the statute, is required to conduct its reviews based on the reports that we in the OIG community will be issuing. So there's obviously an interest in each of us talking about what kind of work we're going to be doing to make sure that we are closely coordinated and understand each other's methodologies and thoughts and come to and make sure we're having that regular discussion. The kind of collaboration that I've talked about, which we will continue as we move forward, is trying to make sure we're leveraging the understandings we have within the Inspector General community along with what is going on externally within the agencies as they move forward as required under the Data Act. For us, the most significant challenge at this point involves the requirement in the statute that the inspectors general across the federal government issue our first report by November 2016. That's our deadline for our first audit report. The problem for us is, under the statute, under the Data Act, the agencies themselves aren't required to report their financial data using OMB's financial standards until May 2017. So our deadline is 6 months before their deadline, which isn't usually, obviously, how you do auditing. And that's obviously one of the challenges we're facing as we look at what do we do, what can we accomplish in connection with the November 2016 audit that's useful for the public, for Congress, for policymakers, for executive agencies, for OMB, if we don't have until May 2017 the data that under the Act that the agencies are required to put together. And in addition, OMB's and the Treasury Department's policies, OMB and the Treasury Secretary aren't required under the Act to ensure that agency information that's posted on the agency website complies with data standards until May of 2018. So as you see from our standpoint as IGs, we're trying to sort through what we can do soon, consistent with our statutory requirements, given those future deadlines. So we continue to work within the Inspector General community, within the working group, across the IG community to try and deal with those issues. Another challenge we're facing in the IG community as we look at these issues is whether we'll have the ability to reconcile the data that's being provided by agencies and posted publicly under the Data Act back through to their source. Obviously, if you're going to audit against that data, you want to go all the way back to the original source of the information. That's one of the issues we're looking at and trying to think through. How can we do that, and how will we be able to do that? And one of the concerns, again, that I have at DOJ OIG, that my colleagues have across the Inspector General community, but mine specifically is how do I validate data that the department has put forward, and then test the completeness of the information that it's provided to Treasury. There are several unknowns as we think about these issues at this point. For example, how often will the information be provided to Treasury? Will Treasury be pulling the data in, or will it be pushed out to Treasury? And how will we audit the completeness of the information that ultimately is provided? We're also working in the IG community to consider the best ways that we can use the data once it's posted beyond making it easier and making it more transparent to us so that we can do our audits and our other work. What we're also thinking about are data analytics. And we're doing that within the Justice Department Inspector General's office. You're going to hear from Dave Williams today, the Postal Inspector General, who's done a lot of work in this area. Across the community, we're thinking about not only how do we audit the data that's being posted, how do we use it to advance that work, but also how can it help us as we make progress in the area of data analytics to use that data to oversee policies, programs, operations, and be more effective ourselves in deciding what programs to look at and where do we get leads for our work. We're going to continue to explore initiatives within our office. We're going to be working closely, and we have been working closely with the IG, with other IGs and within the IG community, to think about how we, as a community, Inspector General community, can advance our work through more effective data analytics use. How do we manage that data? And one of the important possibilities for us is pending right now before both the House and the Senate. Each has an Inspector General Reform Act, and a very important part of that legislation would be to exempt inspectors general, all inspectors general, from the Computer Matching Act requirements so that we could more easily share data with each other as IGs, data obviously that already exists and that IGs already have access to, but be able to share that data with each other more readily so that we can look across agencies and not be cabined within our own agencies to make sure that programs are more effective and efficient, to look for duplicate payments, to look at duplicate grants, to look for those kinds of issues that we are interested in pursuing. Our hope is obviously that Congress will give us that authority. The HHS Inspector General in the healthcare area already has that exemption, and I think it's proven quite useful for HHS OIG, and that's something that we look forward to, and if we can get that kind of authority, it will help make us even better at doing what we're doing within our own agencies right now, which is being creative, sitting with each other as inspectors general, thinking about across the inspector general community, what kind of data should we be looking at? How can we use that data in effective ways to find where wrongdoing is occurring, if it's fraud, and where wasteful spending and ineffective and inefficient spending is occurring. So that's our hope. That is something we intend as a community to continue to pursue. The Data Act is a very important and significant potential tool for us if it's implemented appropriately and the data that is put forward is accurate, if it's complete. And that's what we're going to be looking at as a community in auditing against what information is put forward, but we're also hopeful that we find that the data is in fact accurate and complete, and it will allow us to go further with what we do as inspectors general. So thank you for allowing me to give you some of my thoughts on how the Data Act is working. I've tried to save some time so that I can take questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. So I think we have time for a few questions. So we have We have a couple of roving mics, so who has, here we go, right here in the front. And we'll rove with that one.
I'll rove with this mic.
Thank you, Hudson. Lisette Garcia for your Resource Center. Thank you so much. Your remarks were really inspiring. The one thing I would ask is, could you please clarify a little bit more about the info sharing provision you're seeking? HHS has had a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse under Obamacare,
So the issue, the challenge we face on the Computer Matching Act, we're independent as inspectors general, and one of the challenges we faced on the Computer Matching Act is, in order to get authority to share information across IGs on the Computer Matching Act, is we have to write up justifications, go up the chain, go to the supervisors, go to the managers within the organization whose data we want to get, and the leadership of the organization. And first of all, it's time consuming. Lots of issues and efforts to go through to get that approval for those of us who aren't exempt, but also it's inconsistent with our independence, because we are going to the very people we want to oversee and to find if they're properly managing the programs to get approval to use the data, to share the data and look across it. So our hope is to get that authority so that I can sit down, for example, with my counterpart at the Labor Department, the Inspector General there, and ask who at the Justice Department is both getting a paycheck from the Justice Department and a disability check at the very same time from the Labor Department.
Thank you. Next question, here in the middle.
Rich Butel, longtime Hill staffer, currently retired. SIGGI's legislative subcommittee had recently put together a legislative proposal to open up data stored in the cloud for much broader use and access to preserve law enforcement equities, an important goal that we all support.
Right.
Have you engaged with industry to talk about the concerns that is raising in light of the Snowden effect and the European Union concerns on privacy and things of that nature?
We have engaged in discussions, not necessarily as the Council of IGs broadly, but Inspector General by Inspector General, and I have actually oversight and have issued reports, as some of you may know, about the FBI's use of some of its national security authorities that have addressed some of those issues. And we're certainly cognizant of the concern and understand and are trying to go forward in a way on these issues that, to the extent we can, address the concerns that are present about how we share and put standards in place ourselves for how we're doing it. And frankly, one of the things we stand for is transparency. So one of the things we want to be able to do is, if we get that authority, explain to the public how we're using it. So if people don't like what we're doing, that's public. I mean, that's what we try and do. If people want to critique us, they should be able to critique what we're doing.
Thank you. Next question, here in the middle again.
Good morning, Wyatt Cash with FedScoop. The Data Act generally identifies common terms financially for functions, but there's some discussion that says they don't tie readily to mission. So in an effort to decide, are we having duplicate work creating missions, there's a concern, does the current Data Act go far enough to really help the public and government make those decisions better? Are the IGs looking at any additional meta-tagging and other ways to help identify that?
I can't speak for all IGs. I'm not aware, as I stand here today, of efforts particularly that are underway. I will tell you, I think, both from my standpoint, for example, the Justice Department, I think for those of us in the community, I think one of the speakers mentioned it before, we're trying to address and undertake the efforts we can undertake with what we have now. We have issues with resources, as you probably not a surprise, funding issues. How much we can do is limited by our budgets and the constraints across the federal government. We're not the only ones, obviously. So I think what we're looking at is this is a very possibly positive tool for us in the community. And how do we effectively implement that? And if it works, and much like the information sharing, I think it's very important for us to be able to demonstrate results to the public, much like we expect our agencies to do the same. before we go further and ask for, I think, even more tools in the toolkit. And so I think that's perhaps what you're seeing. I know that certainly, I'll speak for my agency and myself, that's something we're trying to do. We're trying to move forward in an effective, efficient way, given our budget, on the data analytics side.
Great. We have time for one more question. There we go, right in front of you, Hudson.
Hi, this is Darla Marburger with Teradata, and you mentioned that one of the top management challenges was actually data management. And I've actually noticed in my work with agencies the same type of thing, and one of the great challenges is the inability to get executive level sponsorship for data management. So my question to you is, what is your advice to agencies in being able to get that executive level sponsorship to have effective data management?
That's a great question. You know what? One of the things we're trying to do in the Inspector General community is ask these kind of questions and see what management is doing. And I think as we ask more of these questions as a community, management will start looking at those issues. But I know within the Justice Department, for example, management is thinking about how you do that, how do you encourage that, and obviously what you measure is what people will perform to, and what you require in a contract is the kind of data people will collect. And one of the examples I've used in the department, and we will continue to ask questions about this, as IGs, we don't set policy, we don't make the decisions. We can ask the hard questions, we can make recommendations, but it's ultimately up to management to make those decisions for the agency and to decide whether to implement the recommendations we make. They almost always do, but that's for them to decide. But one of the things we're doing, and I'll go back to the Justice Department example for myself, is all of the discussion you see in the public now about prisons, and on the federal level, certainly, the federal prisons are over capacity by about 30%. And they've been that way for many, many years. The Justice Department spends a quarter of its budget on the prisons. That's a significant increase over the last several years. We report on that, and of course, one of the things we've looked at are how are their back-end release programs working? So for example, how is the compassionate release program working? How are halfway houses working? How are alternatives to incarceration working, right? To do that, you need data, and you need to understand, you need measurements. And it's not how many drug tests did we give, or how many people did we hire, or how many people did we process through. It's recidivism rates, it's employment rates, it's training rate. I mean, there are all sorts of things that are being done, and we're spending money in the Justice Department to do. When we do those studies, we're not finding information on recidivism rates. We end up having to do our own statistical sampling, which isn't obviously a complete recidivism study, in order to do that. And we've talked about that with the department. Hundreds of millions of dollars goes out in halfway house spending every year. Those are the facilities where inmates, when they leave a prison, go to so that they can be reintegrated into the community, they can be helped with employment opportunities, et cetera. Hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds of contracts. You would think there would be some effort to get data on some performance outcome-based measurement data, so that you could look at which halfway houses are doing better than others, which ones have innovative programs that's not what we're finding. And so that, I think what you'll see is, and I would suggest as you look at IG reports and you interact with inspectors general offices, in addition to the agencies, to encourage them to look at that kind of performance-based measurements that we've started doing and have been working on over the last several years to do more of, so that our agency that we're overseeing understands we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep reporting on it, we're going to keep speaking to it, and hopefully that will encourage people to take the hard look they need to take on it, and then they can decide whether to make the change or not.
So two last points. The first is we're going to have our networking break now, so please network. Visit the tables outside to see the great technology. The second and last point, which is From your days as a prosecutor using the price of cocaine to ferret out corruption, to recovery.gov and the Data Act implementation, we appreciate your legacy of using data to drive effectiveness and transparency. So please join me in thanking Inspector Horowitz.